the mansion gleamed under hundreds of crystal chandeliers, casting a golden glow over polished marble floors and ornate staircases. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos moved gracefully through the ballroom, champagne flutes in hand, exchanging polite greetings punctuated by sly, knowing whispers. Every corner of the mansion seemed to hum with wealth, power, and unspoken competition, each guest silently sizing up the others, eager to appear superior in both status and taste. Outside, sleek cars pulled up one by one, their headlights reflecting off the marble driveway, adding a cinematic flair to the already opulent scene. The husband entered with measured confidence, his tailored tuxedo immaculate, his posture exuding authority. He held the arm of his mistress with a possessive pride, as though parading her before the crowd like a trophy. Cameras clicked immediately, capturing their entrance, and the murmurs began. Some expressed admiration for the striking pair, others exchanged curious glances, sensing a drama unfolding just beneath the polished surface. The husband's smile was smug, his eyes scanning the room for familiar faces, relishing the imagined humiliation of the woman he had left behind. He pictured her frail, alone, perhaps watching silently from a distant apartment, unworthy of attention in a world she had never truly belonged to. Meanwhile, his pregnant wife sat quietly in her small, dimly lit apartment, phone in hand, scrolling through live photos from the event. Her swollen belly reminded her of the life growing inside her, the innocent soul she protected despite the cruelty surrounding her. She saw the laughter, the elegance, the applause, and felt the sting of betrayal pierce her heart like a sharpened blade. Each captured image of her husband's pride and his mistress's radiant smile tightened the knot of pain and humiliation within her chest. She did not scream, she did not cry openly, her grief was silent, contained, and deep, yet every heartbeat resonated with the injustice of the night. Back at the mansion, the party reached its crescendo. Music swelled as the live band played, laughter echoed through the vaulted ceilings, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with fine wine. The husband moved through the crowd, introducing his mistress to influential acquaintances, laughing a little too loudly, soaking in every approving glance. He leaned close to others, whispering exaggerated stories about his wife's absence, painting her as weak, unworthy, and unfit for the glamorous world he now inhabited. Guests nodded politely, some out of sympathy, others in silent complicity, unknowingly participating in a cruelty that was meticulously orchestrated to break a woman he once vowed to protect. Yet, amidst all the spectacle, the night began to shift imperceptibly. The husband failed to notice the subtle glances of certain guests who questioned his actions, the slight furrowed brows of those who saw the injustice in his display. Unseen by him, seeds of consequence quietly took root, preparing to overturn his confidence and expose truths he had believed safely hidden. Outside the mansion, a storm rumbled faintly on the horizon, the first drops of rain tapping against the windows, an ominous backdrop hinting at the chaos soon to arrive. By the time the final champagne glass clinked and the band hit its dramatic notes, the husband remained unaware that the night intended to humiliate his pregnant wife would not only fail but would become the stage upon which his own life would begin to unravel in ways he could never foresee. He thought he controlled the narrative, yet fate had other plans. The night meant to shame would soon deliver a reckoning that would shatter his arrogance and expose every hidden lie he relied upon for power and pride. In the early days, their marriage had been filled with laughter, whispered promises, and quiet moments of intimacy that made the world feel small and safe. She remembered the nights when he would hold her close, speaking softly about dreams they would chase together, and mornings when he would gently brush her hair back as they shared coffee in their modest apartment. There was warmth, there was trust, and for a time, there was love that seemed unshakable. She had believed that together they could face anything, that the bond they shared would weather every storm. Every small gesture, the way he smiled when she entered her room, the way he remembered the tiniest details about her preferences, made her feel cherished, wanted, and secure in a life they were building together. But slowly, as his career ascended and his reputation grew, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their union. Ambition, status, and the intoxicating world of high society began to dominate his thoughts. Patience, once endless, became thin, empathy was replaced by calculation, love was measured in convenience rather than commitment. Her pregnancy, which should have been celebrated as a miracle, became a source of annoyance in his eyes. He mocked her changing body, made careless remarks about her weight gain, and dismissed the physical pain and emotional turbulence she endured. Nights once filled with tenderness became cold, distant affairs where words were minimal and warmth was absent. She tried silently to endure, reminding herself that love could return, that he could rediscover the compassion he once showed, but every passing day eroded that hope further. Even as his cruelty grew more subtle yet piercing, he introduced another presence into their lives, his mistress. She was everything he believed he lacked in his wife, youthful, dazzling, free of the struggles pregnancy had imposed, and capable of effortlessly blending into the glamorous circles he now craved. Her laughter, her confidence, and her ability to captivate everyone around her drew him in like a moth to a flame. The wife, intuitively and painfully, sensed the shift long before any confirmation arrived. She noticed the late-night calls, the sudden disappearances, the lingering perfume that was not hers. Small clues piled up, each one a needle pricking at her heart, but she held on to what little hope remained, believing that their marriage could survive if only he remembered the woman he had once loved. By the time the fateful party approached, the marriage was fractured beyond repair. The trust she once relied upon had been replaced by tension, anxiety, and quiet sorrow. She carried not only the child of their union but also the weight of a love that had been systematically diminished by neglect and betrayal. He arrived at the party with his mistress, confident, proud, and oblivious to the quiet transformation taking place within the woman he had abandoned emotionally. She remained resilient, her love tempered with sorrow but still present, silently clinging to the hope that her child's future and her dignity would remain intact despite the cruelty surrounding her. Every detail, the whispered conversations, the looks of admiration he bestowed on another, and the invisible chains of humiliation he thought he controlled, set the stage for the night to become far more than a display of arrogance. It was a prelude to the reckoning that would soon strip him of every illusion he clung to. Alone in the dim light of her apartment, the pregnant wife sank onto the edge of her worn sofa, the weight of the world pressing heavily on her shoulders. The photos and live updates from the party glared at her from the phone screen, each image a sharp reminder of the man she once trusted parading another woman before their peers, mocking her presence by absence. Memories of his cold stares, whispered criticisms, and subtle humiliations surfaced unbidden, each one slicing through her resolve. She could still hear the tone of his voice when he dismissed her discomfort, the way he recoiled from her body as it changed, as though pregnancy was a fault rather than a gift. Pain throbbed in her abdomen, a physical echo of her emotional torment. Her breathing grew shallow as fear coiled tightly in her chest, not just for herself but for the life growing inside her. The reality hit harder than any insult or slight. If she remained passive, silent, and compliant, both she and her unborn child might suffer irreparable consequences. She had endured humiliation quietly for so long, hoping for a return of love or even a fragment of respect, but tonight crystallized the truth: waiting for him to act or care would only prolong her suffering. The magnitude of her vulnerability forced clarity upon her. She could no longer rely on a man who had chosen arrogance over compassion, betrayal over loyalty. In the silent room, tears flowed freely, but they were not merely of sorrow, they were the first drops of awakening. Her grief transformed into determination. She realized that survival meant taking control, not for revenge, but to protect herself and the child who depended entirely on her strength. She touched her swollen belly gently, whispering reassurances to the life within her, promising that she would not let cruelty dictate their future. The act of speaking to her unborn child was grounding, a moment of clarity amidst chaos. She understood that courage was not about confronting him in the hallways of the mansion or demanding acknowledgement. It was about reclaiming her agency, quietly and deliberately, in ways that would shift the balance of power forever. Unknown to her husband, subtle changes were already taking place that night. Every message she sent, every action she initiated, every decision to safeguard her future set a chain of events into motion. Financial transfers meticulously planned, silent phone recordings captured for posterity, and careful consultations with trusted allies all began shaping an irreversible path that would soon reveal the full scope of his miscalculations. While he reveled in his assumed triumph at the party, she was quietly constructing the foundation for his downfall, using intelligence, strategy, and the emotional clarity that only profound betrayal could inspire. As dawn approached, a calm settled over her for the first time in months. She was no longer the passive woman waiting to be chosen or humiliated. She was the architect of her own future and the guardian of her child's well-being. The night that had begun with crushing loneliness and despair had transformed into a crucible of strength, fortitude, and clarity. By the time the husband's revelry ended, he remained oblivious to the storm she had begun to unleash, one that would soon shatter the illusions of control he had so arrogantly cultivated. The party roared on, filled with glittering gowns, sharp tuxedos, and laughter that carried across the high ceilings like the hum of a carefully orchestrated symphony. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tension began to coil around the edges of the evening. Guests who had initially admired the husband and his mistress now glanced toward the empty chair, murmuring quietly. Questions began to circulate, curiosity mixed with judgment. Why wasn't she here? Where was the wife, the woman who carried his child? Each whisper, hushed but loaded, began to seed doubt in the carefully cultivated image he projected. A guest, emboldened by the increasing whispers, mentioned her pregnancy aloud. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and some shook their heads in surprise. The mistress stiffened beside him, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time that night. The carefully constructed mask of glamour and control began to show cracks. She glanced around nervously, sensing that the admiration and attention she had assumed as her due were now tinged with something different: unease, judgment, and perhaps even admiration for the woman who had been absent but was far from irrelevant. The husband, sensing the shift, forced a laugh, raising a glass with exaggerated ease. He leaned closer to guests, telling jokes and engaging in light banter, attempting to reclaim the room as his own. Yet the laughter sounded hollow, the movements too precise, the smiles too practiced. The subtle energy in the room had changed, and he felt it, a creeping unease he could not shake. Even as he tried to dominate the narrative, whispers and sideways glances chipped away at the illusion of control. Every introduction he made, every joke he told, every flamboyant display of confidence was met with a slight pause, a raised eyebrow, a quiet questioning glance. Suddenly, a disruption shattered the polished flow of the evening. It came in the form of a phone call, a live message, or a sudden announcement that drew all attention to him. Perhaps it was a reporter entering with undeniable evidence, perhaps it was someone revealing a truth that could no longer be concealed. The specifics mattered less than the impact. The room collectively paused, eyes darting toward the source of the revelation. Conversations faltered, laughter ceased, and the carefully curated atmosphere of elegance and control began to unravel. The husband's face drained of color as realization dawned that the narrative he had so meticulously constructed was slipping from his grasp. The mistress, for her part, felt panic rising. Her earlier confidence now felt brittle, as if the fragile scaffolding of their assumed triumph could collapse at any moment. She clung slightly closer to him, seeking reassurance he could no longer provide. The guests, sensing the change, began to look at him differently, not with admiration, but with scrutiny, judgment, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the injustice he had attempted to perpetrate. In that charged moment, shame began to shift. The pregnant wife, who had seemed vulnerable and absent, became the unseen force at the center of the room. The husband, once proud and confident, now felt the weight of exposure, realizing that his attempts to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly. By the end of the interruption, it was clear, the night would not conclude as he had planned. The carefully staged performance of control and arrogance had been disrupted, and the first seeds of reckoning were firmly planted. The morning after the disastrous party, the fallout began in waves that no one could have anticipated. Social media feeds and private messages buzzed relentlessly with the events of the night, capturing photos, snippets of conversation, and whispered confessions from shocked guests. The husband, once confident in his control and influence, found himself facing a storm of judgment he had never imagined. Colleagues, friends, and associates who had previously admired his success now questioned his character. Invitations disappeared, private alliances wavered, and subtle slights began to accumulate. His professional reputation, meticulously built over years, teetered precariously, vulnerable to every conversation and every pointed glance that referenced the evening's humiliation. At the same time, the mistress confronted her own reality. The admiration and attention she had thought assured were now tinged with discomfort and doubt. She realized, painfully, that she had never truly been chosen for who she was. She had been a convenient accessory to his ego, a shield to replace the pregnant wife he openly disdained. The veneer of glamour and security she once believed in crumbled as she watched the public and private consequences cascade over him. Every approving glance he had once received seemed hollow now, every whispered compliment a reminder that her role had always been secondary, temporary, and contingent upon his whims. For the first time, she recognized the fragility of their alliance and the depth of his misjudgment, a realization that left her isolated and reflective. Meanwhile, the pregnant wife transformed the humiliation into a decisive turning point. She moved with purpose, taking actions that were as calculated as they were bold. Legal steps ensured her protection, affirming her rights and those of her unborn child. Emotional strategies allowed her to reclaim dignity and agency, ensuring that she would no longer be invisible in the eyes of society or those who had attempted to diminish her. Personal decisions, whether in finances, living arrangements, or strategic alliances, solidified her newfound power. Each move sent ripples through her husband's carefully constructed world, signaling that she had not merely endured injustice but was actively reshaping the narrative in her favor. Public sentiment shifted quickly. The woman who had been absent, mocked, and belittled became the figure of admiration. Commentators, observers, and the very guests who had once whispered in disapproval began to express sympathy, awe, and respect. Her strength, composure, and strategic foresight turned the tables completely, rendering the knight intended to humiliate her into a spectacle of his exposure. He could no longer hide behind wealth, charm, or social influence. Every whisper, every photograph, every recounting of the evening served as evidence of his arrogance, cruelty, and moral failure. The consequences extended beyond mere reputation. Relationships fractured, trust evaporated, and the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The mistress's position weakened, the husband's pride and control collapsed, and the pregnant wife emerged as the central figure of strength and vindication. In a single night, the illusion of dominance, the careful construction of ego, and the supposed safety of social status crumbled under the weight of truth, strategy, and resilience. What was meant to be her shame became the clearest measure of his downfall, proving that reputation, power, and control are fragile constructs, vulnerable to the courage and determination of those they seek to diminish. Months passed after the disastrous party, and the world began to settle into a new order, one that no longer revolved around the husband's arrogance or his fleeting illusions of control. The pregnant wife had stepped fully into her own power, embracing a life defined not by the cruelty or approval of others, but by her strength, intelligence, and dedication to her child. She had relocated to a safe, peaceful environment, surrounded by trusted allies and friends who respected her resilience. Every decision she made now was deliberate, designed to protect herself and ensure that her child would grow up in a world of stability, love, and dignity. She no longer sought validation from the man who had abandoned her emotionally. His approval, once so desperately craved, had become irrelevant, a hollow echo of a relationship long since broken. Her presence, though quieter than the spectacle of the party, radiated authority and calm confidence. In public appearances or personal interactions, she carried herself with a grace that demanded respect rather than attention. People who had once whispered about her now admired her decisiveness, foresight, and unwavering composure. The pregnancy that had once been a source of humiliation for her husband became a symbol of her resilience and triumph. Each movement, each choice, and each step forward underscored that she was no longer a passive participant in her own story. She was the author, scripting a future free from manipulation, shame, and fear. The husband, on the other hand, was left to confront the irreversible consequences of his actions. His professional standing, already shaken by the fallout of the party, continued to deteriorate as whispers and subtle judgments persisted in his social and professional circles. The knowledge that he had destroyed not only a marriage but also the sense of security and dignity of the woman he once loved weighed heavily on him. He experienced regret not as a fleeting emotion, but as a constant, gnawing awareness of lost opportunity, irreparable mistakes, and the damage that could never be undone. Every encounter reminded him of the family he had failed, the child he had endangered, and the moral ground he had forfeited in pursuit of shallow desires. The mistress, too, faded into irrelevance, her once vibrant presence overshadowed by the pregnant wife's resilience and strategic victories. She realized that her position had never been secure, that she had been a temporary accessory to a man whose choices had consequences far beyond her expectations. With time, she withdrew from the circles that had once celebrated her beauty and charm, left only with the memory of being part of a failed scheme and a cautionary lesson about aligning with arrogance over substance. In the end, the night that had been intended to conceal and shame became the moment of revelation. The husband's true character, fragile ego, and moral failures were exposed for all to see, while the woman he had scorned emerged stronger, protected, and triumphant. The pregnancy that had once marked her vulnerability now symbolized her enduring strength and foresight. She had not only survived humiliation, she had transformed it into opportunity, power, and protection for the life she carried. The story closes with the unmistakable truth: the night he tried to hide his wife and assert dominance became the night his own world fractured, and her life, and her child's future, was forever secure, unshaken by his betrayal or pride. It was the night that changed everything, irreversibly and forever.